Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at ZZT, which I kind of wish I knew about sooner in life than when I actually found out about its existence. My first experience with ZZT was around 1995, well after its original release, and heck, Megazeux was already out at the time. And since I had discovered Megazeux only a year after ZZT, right around the start of the version 2.x branch, I was pretty much only using Megazeux instead of ZZT not long following. So the nostalgia factor for me with ZZT isn't as high as it might be for some people, and my experience making games with it is very limited. Not that I didn't, but I never got deep enough into it to learn any of the advanced tricks possible. Not to mention I completely missed out on the existence of Super ZZT, something I plan to remedy later this year. In terms of ZZT itself, it's technically a game creation system. And I say technically because you really are limited in what you can do with it, even when you break the boundaries of what's possible with additional tools. But then at the same time, you can do quite a bit with it, and I've seen some people pull off some pretty impressive stuff given what the limitations are. Those of you with experience using Megazeux will notice a number of similarities between Megazeux's built-in objects and the ones built into ZZT, as the original inspiration for Megazeux was ZZT. But what might come as a surprise for some people, actually probably not, is that ZZT itself was also inspired by an earlier text mode based game series called Croz, which I've covered in an earlier episode. Now the irony there is that Croz was created by Scott Miller as a sort of launch game for Apogee. Well, ZZT was created by Tim Sweeney as the sort of launch game for Epic MegaGames. Though at the time, Tim Sweeney was going by the business moniker Potomac Computer Systems, and simply changed the name not long following. There's actually some fragments of the original company name left in some of the worlds included by default with ZZT if you go looking for it. Again, ZZT was created by Tim Sweeney, released under the Potomac Computer Systems brand in 1991, and was later rebranded to the Epic MegaGames moniker in 1992. And it's basically a game creation system, though when using only a minimal amount of scripting, it functions as a one-player action game. It runs in a standard 80 by 25 16-color text mode found on virtually all DOS systems, and as far as sound is concerned, it only supports the PC speaker. As for its current release date, believe it or not, it's actually somewhat ambiguous, and for reasons most people aren't even aware of, because you wouldn't know it unless you read the license agreement. See, the game was never technically made freeware. It was simply licensed out for free distribution in 1997 under the assumption that at some point in time, Epic might want to halt the free distribution rights. But that never happened. Probably because of the sheer speed at which everything was advancing, the shift in content Epic was going through at the time, not to mention the fact that Megazeux was already far more advanced than ZZT or even Super ZZT could ever hope to compare to. So, as a result of this, ZZT is free to download, but not technically freeware as it's not legal to call it as such. Yeah, I know, it's kinda silly, but what are you gonna do? In any case, to download it and a bunch of games to go with it, I recommend starting off with the Z2 website at zzt.org, where you can also find affiliate links to even more ZZT sites in case this one doesn't have enough to satiate your DOS gaming thirst. One thing to keep in mind is that you want to download version 3.2. There's technically a more advanced version 4.0, but there's only a small number of games which require it, and since it's an unofficial hack, you're almost certainly better off sticking with 3.2 for most games, unless the game specifically requires the 4.0 version. Also, before we move on, there's something else I want to address, specifically because of the name of that website. You see, there actually was a spiritual successor to ZZT in the works at one point many years ago called Z2. I have played it, so I know it existed, but it barely got very far in development before being abandoned. So to that end, virtually no one remembers it even existed, and I can find absolutely no information about it online. Not to mention, I've long since lost my copy. So if anyone has any info about it, please drop a comment on the video to share what you know. Despite being a game creation system, there's some general rules of thumb when dealing with a ZZT-made game. Even with extensive editing, the game lacks the features necessary for doing complex controls, so every game ultimately comes down to using the arrow keys in some way, either to move when pressing them alone, or to fire bullets while holding shift. You can also press spacebar to fire bullets in the last direction you moved in, which can be convenient if a game is specifically detecting the existence of bullets to process special logic. We'll go more into that when we start showing some more advanced games. A basic ZZT game typically comes down to collecting things and progressing through the game world to some sort of conclusion. At the side of the screen are various status indicators for health, ammo, torches, gems, score, and keys. Plus, sometimes there'll also be a time limit for a particular board that you might be on. Now, if you run out of health, the game ends. Health is typically restored by collecting gems, as each gem you pick up also counts as a single point of health, though the built-in enemies all do 10 points of damage anytime they touch you, and are killed in the process. Now this already smacks of similarities to Cross, where in Cross, gems were essentially your health, and enemies died if they touch you. Ironically, there's no actual health power-ups, but people making a ZZT game can program in their own health restoring items easily enough. Ammo lets you fire your gun. Now, depending on the screen you're on, there may be restrictions in place as to how you fire your gun, either limiting you to having a single shot in the air at a time, or just not allowing your gun to be fired at all. There's also a trick the more advanced games do, where it'll check for the existence of bullets in some manner, and then use that as a means for bringing up an in-game menu for doing more advanced interactions. The torches are special in that certain areas may be set to be completely masked in darkness, in which case you can only see the position of the player and of other torches, unless you light one of the torches that you have. Upon doing so, the area around the player lights up and stays lit for a brief amount of time, indicated by a small bar set beside the torch counter. The gems have no actual function in ZZT, and instead, game creators are expected to want to use gems as a form of currency. There's also a score counter, which you'd think also wouldn't be used for anything, except it's used for determining high scores when a game over condition is reached, as each game world also tracks its own high score table. As for the keys, this works somewhat differently than in Megazeux. Megazeux allowed you to pick up multiples of every key color up to a maximum key limit. Here, you're only able to pick up one key of each of the 7 different colors at a time. And if you already have a particular color of key and you go to pick another one up, it'll actually block you. One of the staples of original ZZT worlds was puzzles, built out of boulders, sliders, and pushers. Now, one thing that's neat is that unlike most games with pushable objects, in ZZT, you can push entire rows of pushable objects at a time. So long as they can all move in the direction you're trying to push in, they will move. Though this does kind of bring up one semi-annoying thing. See, ZZT's controls are kinda unresponsive. I say kinda because they work well enough if you only need to move one space or need to move a long stretch of spaces by holding an arrow key down. But when you're trying to move by exact amounts or short distances, you're going to find that many of your keystrokes seemingly get missed, and it has to do with how the program processes the arrow key inputs, combined with just a sort of general lag the entire program suffers from. Remember, this thing was first put together in 1991, so computers weren't quite powerful enough to do what ZZT was trying to do at a full frame rate. So the timing system isn't exactly perfect. That said, it is using a custom keyboard handler that won't buffer your inputs when you're holding keys down. So the moment you let go of an arrow key, you will indeed stop moving immediately. There's a couple other things ZZT has which Megazeux doesn't have, at least not without some coding. The first and most notable are centipedes. The centipedes in ZZT function as long strings of enemies, where each time the head moves a space, each segment in sequence moves to fill the spaces left emptied, creating a sort of chain of movement, which is somewhat difficult to replicate in Megazeux for a variety of reasons. If you shoot a mid-segment, it splits the centipede in two. If the centipede runs into a dead end, the front end and rear end swap positions, allowing it to continue moving back the way it came. There's also a duplicator mechanic, and while Megazeux doesn't have a duplicator object by default, it's easy to create one in there. Now, the last thing to touch on before going into the more advanced topics are the blink walls. In Megazeux, there's no such thing. Megazeux has something called lasers instead, which hurt to the touch. But ZZT's blink walls only hurt if you're in the way when they try to form. Otherwise, they're completely solid and do no damage. This is kind of important to know because sometimes the timing on getting past the blink walls in some games can be pretty tight, and it helps when you're holding keys down and just running into the walls as opposed to trying to time it perfectly. Sometimes it's hard to think of ZZT as a game creation system due to its limitations, especially since if you craft a game with it using minimal scripting and heavy reliance on the game's built-in objects, then yeah, every game made with ZZT is going to end up having a similar feel. But it's pretty impressive what people were able to pull off with this thing over the years, and to fully understand how impressive everything got, we need to do some comparisons. For starters, the scripting system in ZZT is vastly inferior to Megazeux. Again, kind of an explanation as to why Megazeux supplanted this thing. But given how limited the scripting system is, it's extremely impressive in what can actually be accomplished. To give an example of how limited it is, there's only 27 commands. Yeah, you heard me right, 27. I'm sure most of you who used ZZT in the past are questioning that number right now for being way too small. But go ahead and load up ZZT and count them out in the programming reference yourself. That's seriously all there is. Another comparison is that Megazeux originally had a limit of 50, quote, counters, which were essentially just integer variables. But ZZT only has a limit of 10 flags, i.e. Boolean values, meaning these flags can only be set to one of two different states, true or false. However, what's interesting about this is that ZZT doesn't actually track the names of false flags, only true flags, which means anytime you set a flag to false, it technically doesn't exist anymore. So your limit is actually 10 flags set to true and an unlimited number of flags set to false. With this in mind, it's possible to mimic the functionality of a variable by simply checking for a true flag amongst every possible value a particular variable you have in mind might have. Though this can get pretty ridiculous if you're aiming for more than just a few potential values. As an example of taking advantage of this effect, one particular game I'm showing right now is called The Mercenary, which tracks your experience level and weapon simply by testing various level and weapon flags down a list until one of them returns true. Since the player's weapon can only be at one upgrade level, and they obviously can't have two different experience levels at once, it's not a dual classing game. Another neat little trick is that ZZT has a debugging feature, which is always available to use by pressing the question mark key. This brings up a text entry in the top right where you can enter something. By entering a plus symbol followed by a name, you can set a flag with the name specified. Or by typing in a minus symbol followed by a name, you can clear it. Even though this was meant strictly for debugging, many ZZT games actually take advantage of this and turn it into a game feature, so that by setting or clearing particular flags, extra game actions can be performed, such as pulling up an inventory or activating a smart bomb to clear the screen of bullets. There's two other important things to keep in mind if you want to try making your own ZZT games. There's a hard limit of 150 objects per board, and while there's no hard limit on the size of a ZZT game, you'll start running out of conventional memory and running into memory errors roughly around the 200 kilobyte mark in terms of world size. So if the size of your game looks like it's going to start to exceed 200 kilobytes, it's probably a good idea to think about splitting it across multiple world files, especially since the larger your game world is, the more you run the risk of things getting corrupted or entire sections of code being lost as you work on them. It's often good to keep multiple backups for this reason as well, at least until you have a finished game. Beyond all of this, it's also common for ZZT game creators to use external tools to assist in making games, as this helps to break past some of the limitations of the editor. For instance, the editor is unable to set the foreground color of things to anything other than the bright colors in the EGA 16 color palette, nor is it able to change the color of built-in objects or the background color of anything other than text. To do this kind of stuff requires external tools, or a little something called the Super Toolkit, which is just a ZZT game world which essentially provides every object in the game in every color combination possible. So you can load up the Super Toolkit world in the ZZT editor, use the Enter key to pick up an object in the exact color you want, load up your own world, and plop it in, so you'll always have access to that exact color and object combination from then on. However, one thing I noticed, and I completely forget if this is a bug on real hardware or not, is that when you use the Enter key to grab something from the board that you're on so that you can place it elsewhere, it doesn't immediately show up on your toolbar in the bottom right, even though it really is actually there. Pressing a key to change the toolbar entirely, such as F1 through F3, then pressing Escape to go back to the normal toolbar, fixes this visual glitch. And again, no idea if this happened on real hardware or not. Once someone fills me in for certain, I'll post the details in the additional information section. Let's be brutally honest here, there's absolutely no reason for using ZZT over Megazeux anymore. Megazeux outclasses ZZT in every way imaginable. Heck, I actually converted Town of ZZT to run in Megazeux many years ago, with Tim Sweeney's permission. There's only 3 reasons for wanting to actually use ZZT nowadays, and admittedly, they're all perfectly valid reasons. 1. You want to check out some of the games that were made with it. 2. You want to challenge yourself to build a game within its limits. Or 3. You just want to bask in the nostalgia of this thing. Again, all valid reasons for loading up ZZT nowadays. But in contrast to Megazeux, it's horribly outdated and a pain to work with. So if you want to make a text mode based game and don't want to worry about weird limitations and laggy controls, you're far better off using Megazeux. In terms of setting this up in DOSBox, you have to set a fixed cycles count. Now, if you run ZZT with the auto or max cycle settings, it'll appear to be working all fine and dandy. However, some extremely weird things may start happening if an object or the player tries to move twice in a single frame of gameplay. Now, I have to admit, I've never seen such weird things happen in ZZT before, but it's probably a symptom of how DOSBox times things out compared to real hardware, and the fact that ZZT is likely doing some odd things in the background to keep its speed up on underpowered hardware. With a fixed cycles count, these weird things don't seem to ever happen, so I recommend setting of about 30,000. This thing doesn't need anywhere near that many cycles to run, but having the extra power certainly helps, given that some games will burn more power than others. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 204 will be on Saturday, February 4th, and we'll be taking a look at another game which is played from a top-down perspective with a guy shooting guns, except this one is done with sprites in a full 256 colors. If you think you know of a game like that, then be sure to send your guest to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned because there's plenty more DOS games to get to this year. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.